Good morning, everybody. We'll give everybody a couple minutes to get all logged on and then we'll get started. Thanks, Sasha. Yeah, I just got this. It's actually a dress. It's all together, which I kind of love. But I love things that have kind of like a little knot or tie, something of visual interest, since you can really only see me from here up. So I've been getting a lot of what I call my Zoom tops. I keep muting myself and I don't know why. No one else is here but Simba. So we'll give everybody just another minute or two and then we'll just go ahead and get started. We're going to pick up where we left off the other day, talking about Freud, good old Freud. Alrighty, well, I'm just going to dive right on back into our PowerPoint, and other people will join as they are able, I am sure. So we will be talking more about the models. So let me go ahead and screen share the PowerPoint, and then I'm going to make sure the chat's up in case any of y'all need to ask questions, things along those lines. You can also always unmute or use the raise hand feature, whatever is easiest for you, wherever you happen to have to be taking this class, which I know, you know, is not always the best option for things, right? I know that sometimes we end up in really weird scenarios. I've done, I think, advising meetings when my husband drove in the car. It's just sort of the world we live in right now. So fully acknowledging that. I'm also going to pull up my participants list just so I can see if anybody comes in late and has questions. Alrighty. So I'm going to go ahead and stand up and adjust my camera so you can see my face. Yep, there we go. Alrighty. So we were talking about Freud, and we had talked about our cookie monster, right? We had talked about the ego. And hang on just one sec. There we go. My office gets a lot of the morning light. So first thing in the morning, I often have to use my fan, even though it's, 30 degrees outside. So it was sucking something in, so I had to adjust it. But okay, so we talked about the ego, the cookie monster. I want this, I want that, I want to eat all the cookies, I want to, have all the sex, all that good stuff. So Freud argues that, you can't live your life like that. It's just not really acceptable in today's society. So what happens at that point is you develop what's called the ego, and we'll talk on the next slide about sort of how you do that developmentally. But the ego operates on what he called the reality principle. And this is the idea that although we have desires, we must operate in an accountable manner. and conform to society's expectations. So we have to engage in acceptable behavior, right? We live in society, even though it can sometimes sort of suck, right? We have to kind of conform to that. Otherwise, we're called abnormal, as we talked about last week. So it's more rational and realistic than the id. It allows us to navigate this space. There we go. So this is really interesting. This is something I believe an earlier edition of your textbook used. I'm not sure if they still include this model or not. But this is just sort of the superego, ego, and id mapped onto the brain. And I'm going to cover the superego in a second here. Honestly, like Freud didn't say these were in any specific spot in the brain. And in particular, Freud thought these lived in the mind, and that the mind was somehow distinct from the brain, right? So, but it is sort of a fun diagram to get an idea around that. So later in childhood, the superego develops from the ego, and it stores your moral rules, your moral principles, and also regulations about how to conduct yourself appropriately. So this is the supermoral, the part of the psyche that always wants to function according to societal ideals. So it's not even just like, this is what you have to do to be acceptable in society. The superego is really like, how can I be the best person I can be within the societal context? So again, if you've done intro psych or there's a personality with me, this will be familiar. If not, welcome to the wild world of the psychosexual stages of development. So Freud introduced these 5 stages, and he argued that personality itself develops in stages, and that abnormality derives from you not navigating through these stages in the sort of prescribed way. At each stage, the id derives pleasure from a certain part of the body. And so that's how he named the phases, based on where he believed the id derived pleasure during that stage. So oral, and one thing I'll say here is that depending on which text you read, the cutoffs for these might differ. So for example, I have seen the oral stage says it goes up to 2 years. I mean, that really doesn't matter, to be perfectly honest. What you want to know is the order these go in. So like, were I to ask you a multiple choice question about this on the exam, I'd want you to be able to order these in the correct order. So the oral stage is getting pleasure through the mouth, so through eating and biting. So hello, good morning. Here, yeah, why don't you go on up? There you go. So this stage, right in the camera. Okay, buddy. This stage makes sense if you've ever been around a kiddo this age, right? So if you hand a baby something, the first thing they're going to try to do is put it in their mouth, which is why you have to be so careful about what you do give them, right? So they don't choke or swallow it, and then you have to rush to the ER. So again, Freud's stages are really sort of poo-pooed now by most psychologists, but there are elements of truth to them, right? There are elements that really do reflect what happens developmentally. So I do like to put that out there. So the oral, if you don't meet each stage, then Freud argued you get fixated there. So he talked about fixation of essentially at least part of your psyche being sort of stuck at that stage. And so the oral personality, if you're fixated at the oral stage, is needy. He argued that behaviors that these people would engage in are smoking, excessive drinking, maybe binge eating. And also, he would argue people who like chew on their pens might be partially fixated here. Hey, bud. There we go. So that's the oral stage. The anal stage is sort of toddler years here. And this is really focused around potty training. Having just done this recently, it is a challenge, but when they get that, it's very rewarding. And they're really proud of themselves too, which is really cute. So Freud thought that at this stage you get pleasure through the anus by retaining and expulsing feces. Hi, do you want me to hold you? I can do that. Okay, this is new. And so he thought that this could go either way. Either your caregiver could be too harsh on you, or your caregiver could be too lax about potty training. So, sorry, he's 15 pounds, so I gotta get him in a secure spot. So if your caregiver is overly critical, you then develop an anal retentive personality. And you tend to be rigid, fastidious, controlling, stingy. We talk at the end of the semester about personality disorders. This matches up with obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So that's something that we'll get into. But Freud said it could go the other way. Freud said if the caregiver doesn't encourage potty training, it doesn't give enough guidance, then you could develop the anal expulsive personality. And these people are messy, under-controlling, and too easygoing. So if anyone's ever seen the play or the movie The Odd Couple basically are the anal retentive and the anal expulsive personalities, who, as you can imagine, just don't mix well together. This is where we get our casual use of the term anal in our slang. Like, oh, he's so anal. That comes from Freud's ideas. All right, then there's the phallic stage. And this is always the one where, again, people who haven't learned about Freud yet are like, whoa. And let's be honest, most psychologists are like that too in this day and age. So the phallic stage is sort of preschool, kindergarten years. And Freud believed that what happens in this stage is that males develop the Oedipal complex. I'm going to throw that in the chat, so if you aren't familiar with the ancient play, you know how to spell it. Helps if I don't have caps lock on. I don't really need to scream Oedipal complex at you. Okay. So Oedipal complex. And he had this idea that boys are attracted to their mothers and hate their fathers because they view their fathers as rivals for their mother's love. But then he argued that boys fear that their fathers will figure this out and retaliate against them by castrating them. So Freud developed this term, castration anxiety. And that motivates the boys to put aside their desire for their mother and identify with their fathers. And Freud argued that during this stage, boys develop the superego because they come to identify with their father's value system, and dads at Freud's times, the Victorian era, were the ones who were out in society, living by society's ideals. So that is the Oedipal complex. Now, really interestingly, Freud just said, oh, women kind of go through that too. And just called it the same thing, but didn't really like match it well. One of Freud's students, Jung, and they later had a big fight and broke up. It was very, very drama. But he ended up renaming this and calling it the Electra complex. So I'm throwing that in the chat for you too. And so females at this stage, was the argument, realize they don't have a penis and they become envious. So this is where that term penis envy comes from. And Freud and Jung argued that girls develop an attraction for their father in hopes that it will somehow like magically give them a penis. And because girls can't have castration anxiety because they don't already have the phallus. So Freud Freud argued that they're never able to get over penis envy, and because they end up identifying with mom, who in Freud's era tend to stay at home, again, certainly the upper classes where Freud treated people, that wouldn't have been the case, obviously, for working class folks. So he argued that women never develop a superego because they just don't have that opportunity, which to me, again, is really interesting in Victorian times where the women were often the enforcers of these social mores. But, you know, that was his explanation. So Freud argued that grown women continue to have penis envy and never develop that strong superego. And so he says, this is why women rely more on emotion than reason. So Freud was pulling information out of what was believed at his time. And then in turn, a lot of what unfortunately is still believed today, right, comes from ideas like Freud's, like, oh, women are more emotional. Well, there's actually not research to back that up. And if there is, then it seems to be an entirely learned behavior. So if we do see those differences, it is not something that's just like sitting in the brain, right, or the mind, as Freud would say. So there is that. All right, so then there's the latent phase. This is really interesting. So sort of elementary, middle school era, Freud said, the id just kind of goes to sleep. Kids are focused on developing their skills and socializing. They play with same-sex peers and avoid children of the opposite sex. And again, like, there's an ounce of truth in this, right? If we think about something like cooties that kids have at this stage, like, ew, I don't want to be around that other person. Okay. Another sort of side note here that I forgot to mention on the phallic stage is, again, there is a little bit of an element of truth to this. So if anyone's ever, you know, been around a younger sibling or maybe your own child or worked at a daycare center, this is the stage at which kids start figuring out that it feels good if they touch themselves in their genital area, right? So like at nap time, you might have to say something like, keep your hands where I can see them. So again, there are elements that you can see where Freud got these ideas. The genital phase for Freud was you hit puberty and then your sex drive returns for good and you start dating people of the opposite sex, and that's when you start having sexual experiences. Obviously, this is super heteronormative, right? So obviously, this doesn't really apply or work for everybody. And Freud did have some explanations of things along those lines of homosexuality and things like that, that, as you can imagine, sort of were convolutedly tied to these ideas, but pretty heteronormative ideas in general. All right, so therapy for Freud, he, as I mentioned before, developed the first talk therapy. And so it used some techniques that we'll see referred to over and over throughout the semester, as we talk about how these therapies would apply for different disorders. So free association is a big one in classic psychoanalysis. So this is where the patient is asked to describe any thought, feeling, image, anything that comes to mind. And then the therapist helps them sort of interpret it over time. Oh, one quick thing I forgot to say is because Freud believed that the therapist should be this blank screen that the client sort of projected everything on, he actually had his office set up, and you can see it here. This is a picture of his London office. So he had clients recline on this couch, and then he sat in this chair behind them where they couldn't actually see him. And that was the on purpose that, again, they would just sort of spit things out and they wouldn't be distracted by what he was doing. Most modern therapies, we actually purposely face our clients and use that human interaction element. But it certainly was Freud's idea that this was an important piece of the therapy. Resistance is unconscious refusal to participate fully in treatment. And one thing I'll say is that some of these concepts are concepts we still talk about today in any type of talk therapy. And resistance is one of them. So if your client is always showing up late, if they're missing sessions without talking to you, if you give them assignments to work on between sessions and they don't do them, right? That's resistance, and they might not even realize they're doing it. And so as my psychotherapy practicum professor, my first year of grad school, always admonished us, when something like that happens, you process it. That was his way of saying you talk it out, right? You try to figure out what's going on with them. Transference is another concept we talk about regardless of the type of therapy we're doing. So that is the client redirecting their feelings about someone else in their life. Could be sort of friend feelings, family feelings, romantic feelings toward the therapist. And again, there is full recognition in this day and age that this is a thing that still happens. And I'll give you a very classic example of this that I experienced on my residency. And some of you have heard this story before. So I got a client transferred to me from one of our psychiatrists, older woman, probably in her 60s, but she had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And so she had to cut down on her client load. And the client was very resistant to, telling me her story or anything like that. And through finally kind of breaking things down with her, I realized it was because she had already formed a sort of transference relationship with the psychiatrist and saw her as like a mother figure. And I was 27, 28 at the time, and she was in her 40s. So clearly she could not form that same transference relationship with me, right? So we spent a lot of time processing it. And she ended up being one of the clients I felt like I helped out the most, honestly. So that was really rewarding. And she was one of the only clients then, as I was leaving my residency, sort of asked me like, what are you going to do with your life? And like was genuinely interested in sort of what my next steps were. So I thought that was a good example of how you can work through transference, but also how it can really throw up roadblocks. Countertransference is also something we still talk about, again, regardless of the modality of therapy you're doing in this day and age. So countertransference is when, as a therapist, you unconsciously express your own opinion or feelings towards the client. So this could be related to things going on in your own life, right? And sometimes this is inappropriate. It's never appropriate for someone to date someone they're actively seeing in therapy. The APA ethics code kind of says like, after like 7 years, maybe. But in general, most psychologists just say like, no, just don't ever date a current or forward patient. So it could be that, but more often it's other feelings. So if you're sitting with a client and you're starting to feel annoyed, or if you're feeling bored talking to them, those are countertransference feelings, and you need to process them perhaps with a supervisor or a colleague to figure out what's going on so that you can address them and still be able to help the client. And sometimes sharing that can be helpful to the client if you do it in the right way. So I had a client who I just started to feel really irritated with her when I was in session, and I talked to my supervisor about I've never experienced this before. And I ended up sharing that with her. This is how I'm feeling sometimes when you're talking. Has anyone else in your life ever expressed that to you? And it turned out, yeah, other people had. And so I was able to, from my experience, show sort of which parts of what she was doing were irritating. And she, I think because we'd already formed a really good relationship, took it really well and used it as a growth opportunity. If I'd come in the second session and been like, you annoy me, right, that probably wouldn't have gone well. But there are ways you can use these things in really adaptive, constructive ways for the client. All right, so resistance, transference, countertransference, we still talk about today, again, regardless of the type of therapy you are implementing. Catharsis. So this was the idea that essentially talk therapy just helps you get stuff off your chest, and then you feel better afterwards. Tony Soprano on the show The Sopranos likened therapy to taking a shit, right? You're just getting something out of your system. And there is an element to that as well. And of course, Freud was very into dream analysis. He would examine the manifest content, what's actually remembered, and then sort of break it down to what he called the latent content or the symbolic meaning of the dream. Current trends in psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapies, short-term psychodynamic therapies are a really big thing that people like. Essentially, they take the ideas of psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapy. Sorry, I'm just finding our next video clip because I thought I had it pulled up and I didn't. They break them down. They put them into, say, 20 sessions or fewer. So you're not going 3, 4, 5 times a week. Instead, you're doing this work in a very constructive way. And I will say that some of these short-term dynamic therapies are the only psychoanalytic therapies that have research support behind them. Now, part of that is because a lot of psychoanalysts don't believe you should do research about these concepts. They sort of believe they're beyond research. But part of that is, just in general, we're finding that shorter focused treatments tend to work better than sort of prolonged, aimless, there we go, that's the word I'm looking for, therapies. Relational therapy focuses on important relationships and attachments early in life and how those have sort of replicated. So like maybe if you had some issue with your primary caregiver, that's coming up in your romantic relationships or your work, relationships, that type of thing. So I am going to share YouTube here so that we can watch this clip. And again, some of you that have been in some of my other classes may have seen this one before. It is cheesy as all get out, but it gets at some of the fundamental principles of what happens in a psychoanalytic session. So I do like to show it. So I'm going to go ahead and share.
This sometimes humorous reenactment of a psychoanalytic therapy session based on an actual case effectively shows the principles of free association, transference, resistance, and dream interpretation in action.
I really don't have much to talk about today. Nothing much has happened in the last 24 hours. Work today was...
So just real quick pause there. 24 hours because he's doing very traditional psychoanalysis where he would have been going 5 times a week, say.
Boring. So I really don't have much of interest to talk about.
When you left here yesterday, you seemed kind of anxious about a date you had last night.
Oh, yes. I don't know why I forgot about that. The whole reason I came to analysis was to figure out what goes wrong every time I start dating a woman. Anyway, the date last night was pretty much a bust. I felt awkward and inept. I took her to a movie, but I couldn't enjoy the movie because the whole time I was wondering about whether or not she found me interesting. She didn't say anything to me, so I kept thinking that she didn't want to have anything to do with me. Anyway, an hour into the movie, she asked if we could go because she was feeling sick. So I took her home. I felt like a complete failure. Oh, that reminds me of a dream I had last night. I was sitting...
So here you can see free association. He's just sort of spitballing, talking about what happened, and then that brings him to thinking about his dream. That's free association.
In a movie theater, but for some reason it was all lit up instead of dark. The name of the film was Crimes of the Heart, which I haven't actually seen in real life. A woman sitting behind me was giggling, so I turned around and looked at her. She kind of flirted with me, so I turned back immediately. Then I noticed a man sitting about 4 or 5 seats away from me in my row. And he looked like a real slob and was incredibly obnoxious. I noticed he was eating buttered popcorn in a messy, disgusting manner. I handed him a napkin. I don't know where I got a napkin from. But anyway, the man completely ignored me and just kept on eating. Then he noticed the woman sitting behind me, and they began to exchange flirtatious glances with each other. Finally, the man got up out of his seat and went and sat next to the woman behind me. They were giggling and carrying on and made it hard for me to hear the movie. Then an usher came up and told me that I was making too much noise and I should leave. I explained to him that it was the couple sitting behind me that was making all the noise, not me. But he didn't seem to believe me. He just kept telling me to leave. I argued with him, but he got increasingly threatening. It looked like he was going to bash me one any minute. Then I woke up.
As you think about the dream, what comes to mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is pretty obvious, I guess. I think about the movie that I went to last night. In both situations, I felt pretty uncomfortable. But my date really looked nothing like the woman in the dream. I can't really say the woman in the dream reminded me of anybody. I know she was wearing glasses. Oh, I just remembered something. She was holding a white rose in her hand. I know that sounds pretty bizarre to be sitting in a fully lit movie theater carrying a white rose.
Does the white rose bring anything particular to mind?
Oh, of course. The woman I took out last night was named Rose. But like I said, she really looked nothing like the woman in the dream. Besides, the woman in the dream was sitting behind me. Wait a minute, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that you are sitting behind me, and therefore the woman in the dream must represent you. I really don't think so, though, because like I said, she really looked nothing like you. Besides, you don't wear glasses.
So again, something kind of fun, cheesy, but gets at some of these main ideas. You saw some transference there in terms of him thinking about the therapist, but, you know, because she sits behind him all the time, he's sort of not remembering what she looks like. So yeah, and then looking at Anaya's comment in the chat, if you haven't been reading that, so who decides how often someone goes? Bunch of factors come into that. A lot of it is therapist recommendation. Some of it is like what your insurance will cover, unless you're paying out of pocket. And then some of it's the severity of what you're experiencing. So, you know, obviously if it's severe distress and you don't think you can prevent yourself from harming yourself or other people, you're probably going to be inpatient hospitalized. If you're maybe a step below that, there are programs called intensive outpatient programs, IOPs, and you essentially go to therapy every day like it's a job, like 9 to 3, 9 to 4, somewhere in that range. And you are learning skills and things along those lines that you can apply. So yeah, depending on the severity, it will determine how often you're seen. Typically, outpatient therapy of any modality except like classic psychoanalysis is going to be once a week. So how would Freud explain our patient, S? So, you know, if you remember, S was biting people, chewing on things. All right. Again, maybe somewhat typical, but by the time you're 4, less likely, right? So Freud would say S is fixated at the oral stage. Also, Freud would look at this history, right? The fact that S was abandoned and then adopted, you know, focusing on relationship or lack thereof with birth mother. Now, just like I said before, every model we're going to talk about has some issues. So here are the main things that people have sort of argued with Freud about. So one of those is, there we go. I had to get my video panel back so I can see y'all are there. One of those is that the thought of sexual instincts being the basis for all behavior. A lot of psychologists have an issue with that and don't really buy it. And in fact, this was, sorry, I just need to, there we go. This was something that was even people at the time of Freud disagreed with him about this. So Freud had like messy breakups with a lot of his colleagues or students, and this is an example of that. So basically, most people, even at Freud's time, didn't buy this to the same extent that Freud himself did. There we go. It was also based on a limited sample of really upper class women in Vienna whose families could afford to send them to therapy this often in an era before health insurance. And also Freud changed his opinion through the years on what the cause of, say, their hysteria might have been. So early in his career, he argued that a lot of these women had been abused by members of their family, friends of the family, and what was happening to them was based on sexual trauma, which really matches up with a lot of modern thinking about these things. But later in his career, at the pressure of the people who paid him, who often were those abusers, he changed the idea and said that the women made all that up, and that was fantasies that they had. There's little evidence for success of the true psychoanalysis with many disorders. You can go for years and not really get any better. Again, that's different for these short-term dynamic therapies, which do seem to have some utility. And then again, if you're doing the classic model, very lengthy, expensive, most people who are therapists in this style don't even take insurance. So typically you see more analysts in affluent areas, New York, LA, places like that, where people can afford to pay out of pocket. And in fact, probably like paying out of pocket because there's less of a paper trail, right? And as I mentioned, it's not based on empirical research, and many of its components can't be empirically tested. And modern psychoanalysts would argue they shouldn't be empirically tested. All right, so next we're going to talk about the behavioral model. So this is based on observable behaviors. So how can we take observable behaviors as hallmarks of a disorder and change those behaviors to help people feel better? And behaviors are defined just as a response an organism makes to its environment. And it's based on theories and principles of learning. And there are three main ones we will focus on here. The first is classical conditioning. So this is based on the work of Pavlov, who actually wasn't a psychologist. He was studying digestion and kind of stumbled across this. Operant conditioning, Skinner's the big name here. And then modeling, and Bandura is the big name there. So we're going to start by reviewing classical conditioning. So classical conditioning was developed, as I mentioned, by Pavlov, and he kind of stumbled on it on accident. So Pavlov was doing experiments where he had dogs, and he gave them food and tried to study the salivatory response. So when they started drooling. So he actually took their salivary glands and moved them outside the mouth so that he could collect it in a tube and measure it. And as he was doing these experiments, he discovered on accident that sometimes the dogs would start drooling before their mouth even hit the food, or even before they saw the food. So he first noticed that they would start drooling when they heard the footsteps of the person who usually gave them the food, of the experimenter who usually gave them the food. And so he said, there's probably something going on here we should look at. And so he decided to start trying different things to see if we could get the dog to drool with it. So he would try lights or music boxes, and the classic one most people think of is bell. He would ring a bell, and if you paired that with food enough, eventually the dog would start drooling just when it heard the bell. And so the joke here is, does the name Pavlov sound familiar? Doesn't ring a bell. Yuck, 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 yuck. Right? So he argued that the food itself is an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to do anything to get the dog to drool when it has food. That happens just naturally based on evolution, biology, saliva actually does start breaking down the food even before it goes to the rest of the digestive tract. Then you start pairing what is originally a neutral stimulus, in this case the bell, with the food. Over time you do this. Every time you feed the dog, you ring the bell. And what you find is over time, with enough repeated pairings, that neutral stimulus of the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus, because you condition the dog, you train the dog essentially to know that food is coming when you ring that bell. So it'll have that unconscious reaction, that unconditioned reaction of drooling to the bell, even if you don't actually give them food afterwards. And so that unconditioned response of drooling now becomes a conditioned response as well. So I like this diagram because it's pretty clear to see that essentially the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are identical, right? They're both the drooling. And I think sometimes other diagrams of this make this way too complicated. So how does this apply to abnormality? Well, we can think about it in terms of anxiety, for example. And in fact, behavioral treatments and theories often revolve around anxiety. So people have a natural fear response when they're threatened, right? So it's an unconditioned stimulus that when there's some sort of threat, you're afraid. Again, we talked about seeing snakes, right? Spiders, things like that, but also like someone mugging you, right, in a dark alley. Say it's night and you're walking down the street and you are threatened by someone that says, give me your wallet or I'll hurt you. And of course you give them your wallet because you don't want to die, right? Fair. But the next time you walk down the same street, you automatically develop this intense fear, because now the street that you maybe walked around every day of your life, no problems, is associated with that event, right? That threat. So now the unconscious or unconditioned response of fear becomes the conditioned response of fear. And rather than just being actually being threatened, it's associated with where you were when that threat happened. And all kinds of things can be associated with sort of what happened when you were around a threat. So we use this explanation, we're talking about phobias, but also PTSD. So for example, some of the vets I worked with when I was at the VA talked about the smell of sand, which I didn't even know sand had a distinct smell, but reminding them of the desert, taking them back to their trauma. So this certainly is something that has a lot of research backing behind it. Alrighty. So next up, we're going to talk about operant conditioning. And in operant conditioning, it's really just about increasing or decreasing behavior by what happens after you do the behavior. And the you in this scenario could be an animal or it could be a person. So we're basically trying to change how often they're going to do that behavior, do that response, by what happens afterwards. So we have reinforcement, and reinforcement is used to get a behavior to occur more frequently. So the idea here is by essentially rewarding the behavior, you try to get that behavior to happen more often. So there's both positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is where you give something that the person, animal, what have you, wants in order to make a behavior occur more often. And the clearest example of positive reinforcement is dog training, right? You teach your dog to sit, you give them a treat. Next time they sit, they want a treat, right? And so they'll do the behavior more often because it means, ooh, I get something good, right? I've actually trained Simba to sit, and he will only sit usually if there's some sort of food involved still. He's not quite like a dog. He's hold up on my IKEA chair in the back, Z'd out. Or with a kiddo, maybe a child is nice to their siblings, so you give them some sort of privilege, maybe some candy, or like, oh, you can watch an extra half hour of TV tonight, something they want in order to get that behavior to occur more often. Then there's negative reinforcement, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not. So negative in this case doesn't mean it's bad. It means you're taking away something. So positive means you're adding something. Negative means you're taking something away. And in this case, for negative reinforcement, you're taking away something they don't want. So you're trying to get this behavior to occur more often by taking away something they don't enjoy. So, maybe this time the kid is nice to their sibling, and instead of giving them something, you say, okay, you don't have to set the table tonight, right? You take away a chore they don't enjoy. There were experiments that were done where, they might apply a light shock to the foot of an animal, and the animal knew it could get away by jumping over a wall. And in that case, we have negative reinforcement. I don't want this light shock. It's annoying. So I jump over here. I don't have to have it anymore. We know this also works in psychopathology. So thinking about the example I just talked about with the street suddenly being associated with your threat, what people with anxiety will start to do is avoid those scenarios that remind them of that threat. If you avoid that street where you were held up, then that's negative reinforcement because you don't have to experience those awful feelings, right? The anxiety, the fear that you experience when you go down that street. And maybe for something like a street that isn't that problematic, or like you avoid snakes if you have a snake phobia and you live in a place where they're not very prolific. Great, but what if what reminds you of your anxiety or your trauma is something related to work, right? So I treated a vet who had to leave the room every time someone talked about Iraq. And that was really problematic because even though he had gotten out of the army, he still worked civil service for the DOD. So that happened a lot. So it was really interfering with his job. But by leaving the room, he got that negative reinforcement of, I don't have to deal with the anxiety and the awful feelings I feel when we talk about this. So then he was more likely to leave the room because he knew that that was helpful. But obviously that was interfering with his performance at work. All right, so reinforcement is always that you're trying to get a behavior to occur more often. Punishment is where you're trying to get a behavior to occur less often. And there are both positive and negative punishments as well. So again, these are hard to wrap your head around a little bit, so I like to explain them kind of slowly. So positive punishment, again, remember, positive here means like addition. You're adding something. It's not good, right? So positive punishment is adding something they don't want to keep a behavior from occurring. So a classic example, again, not like a morally good example, but is spanking to get a behavior to occur less often. It's really not recommended now. Psychologists have found that it leads to a whole host of consequences that are really problematic. But that's a classic example, right? Negative punishment occurs when you take away something they want to make a behavior occur less often. So maybe this time a kid, rather than helping their sibling, they deck their sibling, right? That never happens in sibling relationships ever. And you don't want to encourage that behavior, so you want to punish it. So maybe you do it by taking away something they want. So you can't have TV time tonight. You can't watch your favorite show, right? Or in this day and age, I think a lot of times it's taking away your cell phone for X amount of time, right? So you're taking away something they want to essentially sort of teach them not to do that behavior. So punishment is always trying to stop a behavior, and you can do that with positive punishment, adding something they don't want, or you can do it with negative punishment, taking away something they do want. Now, on exams, people routinely will think negative reinforcement is positive punishment or vice versa. So the easiest way to remember this, and I'll actually throw this in the chat, I typically write it on the board, but again, that reinforcement is always to get a behavior to occur more. Punishment is always to get a behavior or less. Positive, whether it's negative or whether it's reinforcement or punishment, means adding something. And negative, again, it's not a moral judgment, but it means taking something away. So if you can remember sort of those simple definitions of this, it makes it a lot easier. And then we're not sort of hung up on what those words mean typically in our society. All right, so now we're going to talk about modeling, which is also sometimes called social learning. And so this is really important in humans because we learn a lot by watching others because we're social beings. So modeling involves learning by watching and imitating the behavior of others. So you yourself are not being directly punished or reinforced, but you watch someone else do a behavior and you see what happens to them. So like, are they reinforced for doing that behavior? Maybe you're more likely to try it, or maybe they just don't have a negative consequence, right? Or are they punished and then maybe you're less likely to do it? And this is one of the arguments for our justice system. The way it works is that by applying punishments, not only can we hopefully help the criminal learn, but deter other people. And whether that works or not is certainly up for debate. So again, I'm going to screen share. I have a little video here that is a nice illustration of this, and it is a classic Bobo doll study by Bandura. And again, some of you may have seen this before, but it is a classic, so I think it's always good to watch it again. So,
to watching an aggressive adult.
I think this is the version we want. Yeah.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. For example, to test how well bombardiers have learned bombing strategies, you would use simulated targets rather than require them to bomb San Francisco or New York. The model pummeled a doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained
So we'll stop there. But I like this one in particular. I'm going to just screen share a different screen here. But I like this one in particular because you see that it wasn't just the boys that were aggressive. I think we tend to think that. But this adorable little girl with her pigtails was also aggressive. So I'm just going to share real quick. A couple of years ago at APA, they actually had an exhibit from the History of Psychology Museum, and they had one of the Bobo dolls. So I thought that was really interesting. This is one of the actual Bobo dolls that you were able to see. And I've seen things like the Stanford prison experiments, whistles, and things like that too there. So that's kind of cool. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and keep talking here. So, okay, we've got this behavioral model. What do we do then, right? How do we take that and apply it to helping people feel better? So treatment focuses on observable behavior and trying to change the behaviors that are causing problems. So lots of different ways to do this. And again, like I said, a lot of this focuses around anxiety. So for anxiety, you are doing what's often called exposure therapy. And exposure is where you expose them, literally. You have them interact with whatever that feared element is. And so it might be, again, like think of something like snake. If it's something like you had a trauma, more and more, they're starting to use like virtual reality to recreate that scenario. But you can also do what's called imaginal exposure, where you just have the person think about being back there, tell their story about being back there. The way this is typically done is by using systematic desensitization. And this is, again, specifically for phobias. You have them create a hierarchy of like, what is the most terrifying aspect related to that thing, right? So let's use a snake just because it's easier. Probably it's holding the snake, right? And then what's the least terrifying? Maybe being across the room from it and it's clear the snake is secure, right? And then systematic desensitization is then you work up that hierarchy throughout your therapy sessions. And so you might start by like looking at the snake through the door to the room, right? And move closer and closer. And then, eventually have them hold it. And a lot of times modeling is incorporated in this where the therapist does it too. And I have a funny story from grad school where my grad advisor, when she was a grad student, they tried to get her to be the therapist for someone with snake phobia. And she said, I can't. And they said, why? And she said, because I'm afraid of the snake. And then they were like, okay, now you have to go through systematic desensitization for this. So certainly sometimes therapists, again, have to work on aspects of themselves. As you go through systematic desensitization, you would have people use relaxation in between. So you would teach them diaphragmatic breathing, for example, muscle relaxation. More modern behavioral therapies teach mindfulness meditation as part of this as well. Problems with this treatment, some people argue it's just too simplistic. It's assuming, it's kind of like the biological model, right? The biological model is assuming everything is just easily identifiable in the brain. And this is just assuming everything's easily identifiable from the observable behavior. And we know that that's not true. Humans are pretty complex, right? And it doesn't necessarily address underlying beliefs or why the behavior exists. And it doesn't always generalize. So even if that person is able to hold, your boa constrictor in the office, that doesn't mean that when they see a garter snake while they're out pulling weeds, they're not going to freak out, right? So that can be an issue as well. So how would they explain S? Perhaps his behavior had been unintentionally reinforced. So maybe he's only getting attention when he acts up, right? This is pretty typical why kids keep acting up. Perhaps he saw this behavior modeled by someone else in his life. If you remember, he has a fear of loud noises, so maybe doing some sort of exposure for that. And for kids especially, or people with really severe psychopathology, something like a token economy can work. And we'll talk about this later in the semester in more detail when we talk about schizophrenia. But essentially, a token economy is, the best analogy for me is Chuck E. Cheese, right? So you get something that you can build up to get something. So like at Chuck E. Cheese, you're getting tickets, right? And eventually you can get that eraser on the bottom of the shelf, or if you get a ton, then you get the giant stuffed animal or whatever, right? So you can do things like they get gold stars, and after X number of gold stars, they get something. Or the one that was classic for me growing up an 80s kid was Pizza Hut used to have this program called Book It. So in the summer, you read books, and after you'd read X amount of books, you got a free personal pan pizza. And Pizza Hut made money because your parents had to take you there and buy their own pizza, right? So win-win. So that's a token economy. Again, for the cartoon, maybe we're focused too much on the stimulus response, right? All right, so now we're going to start talking about the cognitive model, which really was partially developed in response to the simplicity of the behavioral model, but also, to be perfectly honest, developed to counteract these sort of untestable theories of Freud. So really, this model in particular focuses a lot about science, like can this therapy actually work? What makes it work? Things along those lines. So two similar theories were developed essentially simultaneously for this. So Albert Ellis developed Rational Emotive Therapy, or RET. It's now also called REBT, the B for behavior. And Ellis's therapy consisted of helping people think more rationally, hence the irrational piece of it. Also thinking more clearly and scientifically and flexibly, not being rigid in your thoughts. To feel more appropriately, so that is that emotional component. And then the behavioral component is he tried to help them act more functionally. And then partially inspired by the work of Ellis and some other folks as well, Baron Beck, who is still alive in his 90s, he developed cognitive therapy. He originally developed it for depression, but then he applied it to other disorders. I think I mentioned previously, he's still working on testing schizophrenia in his 90s. But it's been applied to a whole host of disorders as well. And he focused around cognitive distortions, so people who are seeing or thinking of things in a not accurate way. And then he talked about automatic thoughts. So these are thoughts that just pop into our head that are negative in a lot of situations and where we kind of beat ourselves up, essentially. And he got the idea from that because he was originally trained as a psychoanalyst, and he found that as he was analyzing the dreams of his depressed patients, themes came up around sort of beating themselves up. And so he was like, I wonder if they have any of these thoughts while they're awake. And they did. And then there's the negative cognitive triad, where he argued that depressed people in particular have a negative view of the future. Nothing's ever going to get better, themselves, I'm a horrible person, and the world around them. The world is a horrible place, and there's nothing we can do to change that. So this is the model for the cognitive explanation for abnormality. So you're in the situation, and that's going to activate those automatic thoughts. You know, let's say you get a bad grade on an assignment. Automatic thought is going to be, oh, I'm so stupid, right? And that might come from a belief that you have that, like, I'm never going to be good enough, something really core in there. And then as a result of having that thought, you're going to experience certain emotions, you know, feel depressed, feel down, behave in certain ways. So maybe you'll kind of give up and not try in the future because you feel like it's not going to matter. And you could even have physiological responses. So with depression, it might be eating more, sleeping more, moving more slowly than usual. With something like anxiety, you actually have physiological responses that can feel even like a heart attack, right? So, but he says, the cognitive model, and Beck in particular, says that it is these automatic thoughts that make us feel that way. We could be in the same situation, and if we had a different automatic thought, we're not going to have the same response, right? So if you get a bad grade on your assignment and you're like, well, I only took 5 minutes on this, so maybe I should work harder next time, you're not going to experience those same physiological, behavioral, and emotional responses. So the cognitive model in this day and age has essentially merged with the behavioral model, and it's called the cognitive behavioral model. And in fact, the big conference I go to every November, like virtually this year, is the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. So it's really around this framework. And so this is the cognitive behavioral model, out of which comes cognitive behavioral therapy. And so therapy is going to address the underlying negative thoughts, cognitions, and work with clients to change them, to modify them. You want to create more functional beliefs, more accurate beliefs, and behaviors. Now, one side note with this is some people, when they hear this, assume that cognitive therapy means just changing everything to sort of a Pollyanna, unrealistic, positive view of the world. That's not at all what this is about. It's about accuracy. So like one of the famous clips, I think I'll show you when we talk about depression and treatment for that, Erin Beck is working with a woman who is in the midst of separation, probably going to get a divorce. And she's like, I thought we were going to be together forever. And he's like, is that realistic given the statistics about marriage? Right? And you're kind of like, whoa, Debbie Downer, Erin Beck. But it's, again, about thinking realistically about things. And doing that also helps you to get rid of some of that guilt and beating yourself up, right? These are pretty widely accepted in this day and age. They have a lot of empirical support because Beck founded his ideas around this is something we need to test empirically. So a lot of research in this area is just started with, does this therapy work? And now more and more we're getting to studies where we're trying to figure out which components of what we're doing actually work. So I have a colleague who is at Louisville, and her research actually focuses on tailoring treatment for eating disorders, cognitive behavioral treatment for eating disorders, to each person specifically. So she does like a week of data collection about that person, and then based on that, they pull out the components that are going to help that person specifically. Really cool cutting edge stuff. Not many people are doing that right now. So how would the cognitive model explain S? So he's in this stressful situation. There's a new baby or, younger sibling coming in. So that's going to lead to some automatic thoughts. The world's a scary place and there's nothing I can do about it. I'm afraid of losing people. Maybe if I allow them to show me too much affection, again, thinking about that history of adoption. And again, these are sort of wordy. This is a criticism actually of the cognitive model, is that it is sort of expecting you to be at a certain intellectual level that, like, say a 4-year-old might not be at, but also people with some severe psychopathology. So you want to monitor and challenge these negative thoughts, and you can include exposure elements for anxiety and behavioral methods for the hyperactivity. Alrighty. So next we're going to talk briefly about the humanistic model. This comes out of Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy, and it subscribes to the belief that human beings have an innate capacity for goodness and living a happy, healthy life. And the therapy in and of itself is trying to help people accept their true selves so that they can love others, be creative, and gain meaning to life. And it is about honoring that other person and empowering them to help themselves. The idea is that when society pressures us to conform to norms, we can lose our identity, and that's going to lead to abnormality. And it's driven by self-actualization. And some of you may have seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs before. This was a model that another humanist, Abraham Maslow, there we go, couldn't think of his first name for a second. And the idea was you've got to meet the lower needs before you can get to sort of this higher, I'm going to be the best person I can be. So it starts with just physiological need. You've got to have food, water, safety needs. You've got to have shelter, right? Then we get to love and belongingness, acceptance by others, friendship, love, and then starting to believe in yourself, those esteem needs, working up to, again, this self-actualization, this big goal. And so for us, we want to meet those lower needs. In particular, maybe his love and belongingness needs aren't being met right now. And then we'll move towards esteem. Now, the existential model says that people become overwhelmed by the pressures of society, so they look to others for guidance. And in doing so, they give up their agency, their personal choice. And so in existential therapy, people are encouraged to accept responsibility for their own lives and issues. Both the humanistic and the existential model are plagued by a lack of research. So there isn't anything empirical to really back them up. And in terms of the humanistic model in particular, so some people really resonate well with this, but the therapist is very non-directive. The therapist really just tries to get the client to come up with their own solutions to things. And some people find that really helpful and warming and affirming. And some people, it drives them crazy. When I show videos of Carl Rogers, like, I'm always like, this is so great. I feel like I would feel so cared for working my therapist. And there are always students who are like, that drove me nuts because he didn't ever actually tell the client anything. So just sort of know that going forward. So the existential model would say for S, he needs to take responsibility for his own life and not, again, get into trouble to get attention. All right, we'll stop there for today and we'll wrap up with this, just a couple more slides on Tuesday, and then we'll start getting into our research methods as well. Let me stop share here so I can see your lovely boxes, and for some of you, your lovely faces of your still photos. We'll stick around for a couple minutes in case anyone does have any questions about anything going forward. And if not, everybody have a great weekend. Be safe, wear your masks.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you were talking about the behavioral model, I think you mentioned briefly mindfulness. And, I've been to counseling service and stuff like that in my previous school, and we worked a little bit on that. But I've also read that it's not really backed up by research yet because it's so new. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I will say this, the therapies that include mindfulness components in them are backed up by research. So in particular, I'm thinking of acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and then also dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. Now, I don't know, probably someone's doing this and I'm just not as familiar, but I don't know that they've pulled out the mindfulness component and just looked at that to see if it's worked. I know that there is a specifically mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for like depression or anxiety, and that has some efficacy behind it. And the really interesting thing about that, I had a grad professor who was doing research on that, and he was doing it with individuals who had survived heart attacks and were going through cardiac rehab. And not only did it help them sort of with their psychological issues, but it also did things like lower their blood pressure, which was really cool. And obviously a good thing in cardiac patients. So yeah, I would argue that, I would say based on the research, there is evidence that at least it works in a larger package, but I don't know if there's research showing it works just on its own.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Yep.
Dr. Myers, I had a question about the